Hello and welcome to the third webcast for Growing Old Around the Globe. I'm Sarah Kagan and I'm really thrilled to welcome Herb Smith, whom most of you have watched in his video interview. Herb is our special guest for today. But what I'd like to do first is to run through some announcements. Just like in a bricks and mortar classroom, we do have announcements. The first of which is that Brian and Aram, you remember Brian and Aram, I think, from the discussion forums, are working very hard to improve the technology for our webcasts. I know a number of you have been frustrated by the sort of unsynchronized sound and picture, as well as problems with the sound. That was not actually a human error. That is a technological problem that these guys are working incredibly hard to fix. So bear with us. And what we would strongly encourage you to do is to look at the archived webcast on YouTube after you've watched it, even if you've been able to participate live, in order to pick up any details that you may have missed. The other thing that I wanted to very much publicly explain is that there's been a great discussion about the fact that Coursera owns submission, portfolio materials, that sort of thing. But please understand, neither I nor any of the OldGlobe team members have any interest in doing any kind of research or any manipulation of submitted portfolio materials. If we were going to do research, which we may do at some time in the future, we would actually ask for each individual participant to give consent and to give consent about the specific research question that we had. At this time, we have no active plans to do any research, and we have no plans to do anything with the materials that you submit to your portfolio assignments or your portfolios as a whole. So I also will post this on the discussion forum, but I hope this relieves any anxieties that you might have about our intents and our purposes. We want you to have your portfolios as your material and to experience that as an educational enterprise for yourselves, but we have no intention to use those materials ourselves. I also wanted to respond to questions and concerns about subtitles and the text file transcripts. As Brian and Aram have both noted in the week 3 threads, we have requested those as of Friday from Coursera. I'm going to follow up with Coursera personally just after the webcast. We appreciate your patience. We recognize, because remember, we truly are a global community here in Growing Old Around the Globe. We recognize that for many of you, if not for most, English is not your first language and that you require and rely on the subtitles and text file transcripts. So do bear with us. The other operational piece that I wanted to remind you of is that we are taking a break next week. We're essentially splitting OldGlobe in two. This period, these first 3 weeks, have really been about building content and building discussions. We're going to take a break next week, and you'll notice that the submission deadlines for both the portfolio assignment and for the peer review portion of the assignment are modified to reflect that break. When we start again, our 4th week is the week where on the 10th of July, our webcast will be the same day. Remember, we're meeting for the webcast on a different day of the week, but same day. July 10th is a Wednesday, but it's at a later time. The webcast will begin at 11:30, 11:30 here on the East Coast of the United States. So please adjust that based on where you are in the world. And I think with that, we will launch now into the content portion of the webcast, and we're thrilled to have Herb back. And I know a number of you on the discussion forums noted how excited you were to listen to Herb and his thoughts about demographic trends and issues of life expectancy and longevity, among other ideas within aging societies. what we have collected are a set of questions for you, Herb, that really, I think will help advance some content. So probably the first one is a really good fundamental question, and that is, are a population and a society one and the same, or are they different?
So short answer is they're basically one and the same.
Okay.
Intermission between the short and the long answer is, Sarah, thanks for having me back. I think this is really cool that everything that you, Coursera, the course, and so on are doing. This is fantastic. One of the nice things about growing older is you remember a deeper and deeper past, and we didn't used to be able to do such things and involve so many people. So that's very good. So yeah, the basic answer is that for societies and populations are essentially the same. And this is usually not the kind of thing that people want to hear when they're learning a new subject, but these definitions are flexible. At various times in human history, we didn't have nation states, so it was a little harder to define what a population was, what a society was, and so on. Nowadays, everybody is bounded in a nation state. And so for just accounting purposes, we consider the population of Ghana to be the people living in Ghana. And you could just as well talk about Ghanaian society, might be a little bit more of a flexible term, but for the most part, we're talking about the same things. It's only in the ugliest human cases, maybe the former Soviet Union or something like that, where people get formally defined as being outside of a given society or something like that. But in general, same thing.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea, because it also reminds me that depending upon in which discipline we're using a term, the term will vary. So for example, we're not using the word population in a biological sense here. We're using it in a social science sense.
Completely. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it's, but the boundaries are never sharp, even in biology.
That's very true. Yeah. And that's, I think, one of the things that a number of people in the discussion forums have commented upon is where's the hard content? And in fact, especially when we're talking about social phenomena, societal issues, psychological issues, but also in biology, we're really not talking about something that is static and fixed in its definition. And I think it's important for us to remember that, and important to remember that the more we accumulate knowledge and the greater the discourse becomes, we really have an opportunity to think about these concepts in ways that promote understanding and build knowledge, not just sit there and sort of define something.
That's right. And you know, these things only come to the fore when they become problematic. The obvious example that's going on right now in the United States, but also with our neighbors in Mexico, is the whole question of immigration reform, because it boils down in many people's understanding to, you know, who's in American society as opposed to what the population of the 50 states of the United States is. So, you know, part of the whole problem of regularization and so on is that you have, in demographic terms, a population where there are literally people, and they are for various reasons not legally members of the society and so on, although in a participatory sense of seeing each other on the street, you know, buying things at the 7-Eleven, everybody's doing the same thing. But so the concepts, they're pretty much on top of each other, but it's precisely when they're not on top of each other that you need to think hard about them.
Yeah, and your point about immigration is so critical, and I believe we mentioned this during our formal interview, but I think it's worth sort of reiterating that often migration and immigration are critical for aging societies. Think about societies, because remember, Herb's the one who taught us that aging societies are defined by birth rates, not by how long you live. So if you don't have enough younger people to provide care to those in the society who are dependent, you're really in a situation of having to look to younger societies often.
That's exactly right. And a lot of work, professional work in my field, gets into calculating the extent to which there are the cost benefit of an analysis of bringing people in and so on. I mean, in some ways, and I don't think people usually like to talk about it, but when people fume about illegal immigration and things like that, the truth is that it provides a certain benefit when you have people coming in, contributing to Social Security, but then having to migrate back to Mexico and so on, and not being in any position to tap their funds and whatnot. This is a case where people claim they deplore the illegal situation, but it's actually financially beneficial in this exchange between when you contribute to old age support and when you draw it out.
Right.
So, a lot of these things, look, there's lots of people listening, and it's always important not to try to say that this is right and this is wrong and so on, but I'm just trying to suggest that often people need to reflect that many terms that they imagine are fixed with regard to the costs and the benefits are a little more subtle from a population perspective and an economic accounting perspective.
And there are generally at least two sides, if not more.
Just depending on how you look at the whole thing. So a lot of the whole question is, essentially, if the U.S., Europe, take in people from other countries and so on. Yes, this can in some sense supplant the people who are no longer being born in the host societies. But then the question is once you regularize people, what is the over the life cycle contribution and taking out going to be in a strictly economic sense? Maintaining illegality is actually somewhat profitable.
Yeah, and I don't think many people will have thought about it from that dimension, but it's important, again, particularly when we're talking about aging societies. And I guess that leads to two other questions that have been contributed to by participants. The first is, let's talk about the general one. You mentioned your field, which is demography.
Right.
Could you just kind of give us the thumbnail sketch of what is demography and what does it do?
Yeah. Okay. So again, I mean, demography is, at the very narrowest sense, a real form of accounting. It's just an accounting, just like a balance sheet for a company or a bank of inflows and outflows, except in this case it's people, defined as a population, where the population is usually a geographic entity, the United States, Mexico, Ghana, whatever. And at different times you have different numbers of people, and it's created by very simple set of inflows and outflows: births, deaths, people who move in, people who move out. You can make it more complicated by subdividing us by our sex or gender, by our ages, and so on. But basically, it's an accounting scheme. Now, that's the primitive. That's the simplest form. Because there are all these kinds of questions, scientific questions, policy questions, and so on, about contributions to Social Security, borders, immigration, and so on. There's a whole overlay of subjects that are related to demography that demographers study for why people have kids, why they have as many as they have, and so on. Whether people are happier or less happy when they have more kids, less kids, no kids, and so on. These all become the kind of interesting crust that grows up around the kind of just accounting core.
The core stuff. Yeah. So that means that, for example, studies about happiness levels in populations, in societies.
Yeah, those are fascinating.
Those studies, which many people are really taken by, are also really demographic studies.
Oh, totally. And in fact, I always like to point out pen connections, but I mean the great the core of studies on the relative happiness of societies and populations, and the so-called paradox that wealth does not necessarily translate. It was one of my esteemed predecessors in the Population Studies Center, Richard Easterlin, a very famous demographer and economist who's now at the University of Southern California. But very much, he was a president of our population association 35 years ago, you know, so very much in demography.
Yeah. And these are then studies that are often most interesting, done over time. As populations change, those studies that look at things like happiness, for example, are important because we can see what's going on in a society at a different level.
That's right. And then people seek to understand why this is, because at first glance it's a bit counterintuitive. Everybody acts as though the more we accumulate and the more we have at our disposal and so on, that'll make us happier, but the evidence is against it. But for me, just to say the evidence is against it isn't going to make people not want things, isn't going to make people not bristle about inequality and so on. So the kind of question is why doesn't it translate into happiness?
Well, where's the disconnection in what seems like a simple association?
I mean, and since I got on the topic, I mean, Easterlin's current view, and there's good evidence for it, is that what really matters are minimal standards. That is to say, the kinds of things that successful societies can do for their members in terms of maintaining basic levels, including care for the aged and so on. I mean, these things turn out to scale very well. Once you get beyond people universally within a society being able to count on a certain level of support, and I don't mean just other people's support.
For example.
Education, that's right. I mean, as long as you have a certain number of those things, people seem to be happy, whereas you can have perfectly rich societies where there's a lot of uncertainty regarding those things where they don't scale as well with happiness. So yeah, very much a topic studied by.
And I guess happiness then leads to my second question that I think our discussion is aiming toward, and that really is about some things on the discussion forum around what we might call stagnation or despair if we were looking at Erikson's theory of the life cycle in psychological terms. And a very active participant, Roseanne, asks, how long on average is senior dependency and associated end-of-life impairment? And she has been watching very assiduously and said, Herb mentioned that these periods have not really shortened with increased longevity, but rather are just delayed. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I mean, they are delayed. You know, we'd have to go population by population because places are in different health. If anybody wants to Google it, the master of these kinds of studies is a man named James Vopel, who is both at the Max Planck Institute in Rostock and at Duke University here in the United States. It's V-A-U-P-E-L. But to give you an example of the kind of things that come out of his shop with Zheng Yi, a well-known Chinese demographer, they've got estimates that in China, even for males at 80 years old, 80 years old is now is not, of the life expectancy remaining, about 80% of it should be in good health. Only 20% will be in bad health.
Right.
And even when you get up to 95 or so on, maybe only 60% is in bad health of what remains to people and so on. So it's not too hard to find life expectancies, and it turns out that a fair fraction, even as we get to the older and older ages. I know it's not exactly the answer, because in some ways the question would be, and I'm wishing I had the number on the tip of my tongue, but I mean, one of the things that Vopel has shown essentially for the US and similar societies is that since in the last 60 or 70 years, we've basically had about a 20-year shift, and I think I mentioned this before, so that, a 60-year-old now is at the same position as a 40-year-old was, mid-20th century in terms of what they could expect. Now, having said that, the questioner probably wants to know, is it 3 years or 4 years that you're going to still suffer, in a dependent relationship, kind of role at the end, and I will try to find that before the next time I show up here, but like I say, Vopel, V-A-U-P-E-L, and his research group have lots of information on that.
And I think your reference to Vopel and your interpretation of what's happening at a population level is very important for us, because this is not a MOOC, a massive open online course, really geared toward health. In fact, what we've done is to steer away from sort of the medical and health dimensions of what could be a very long kind of dissertation on health in late life. But your comments really make me think about that classic geriatric medical, and it's really a public health concept of compression of morbidity. And that is that what we've tried to do in healthcare at a population level is to compress morbidity, or that time that you're sick and dependent at a population to the smallest portion of the lifespan that we possibly can. But instead, we haven't really seen, we expected with the advancement of healthcare, we expected to see that compression. We haven't really seen significant compression of morbidity in the way that we might have projected 35 years ago.
True, but it's important to remember that given how much life expectancy is increased, if you turn the problem around a little bit, the way I was sort of quoting the statistics on China and so on, and pose the question somewhat differently, which is, how much time now does a 60-year-old, have to spend in, with severe limitations or in disability or something like that? It's becoming less and less and less because there's more and more time before they hit that. The fact that either we're wired this way or something like that, that so far we seem to have run up into some kind of limit of as our bodies eventually start to fail, how much we can hold things off. It doesn't strike me as all bad, given that the day that comes is further and further out. So, a lot of what we do as demographers, in fact, is write papers turning these kinds of arithmetic problems around a little bit. And, I would turn back the clock a little bit and sort of say, when people really thought that they were going to solve this, morbidity problem and get rid of sickness, and everybody was going to be very comfortable and then die suddenly in their bed and whatnot. If you'd sort of said, well, that's one model, but here's another model, you can have, every decade an extra year or two of life for the population and so on, so that after 50 years you're up another 10 years of life expectancy and so on, and you're still going to have these problems at the end and so on. Aren't you buying a lot of time? Because remember, you sort of say, well, 5 years, 10 years, but multiply that, this is the population perspective, over millions of people in a given population, and you're now in the demographic concept of person years of unencumbered life, and it's fantastical how much more there is on the globe.
Yeah, and that sort of, I think, turns us toward generativity. And there's a thread, well, there are two threads in the discussion forum that I wanted to comment upon and bring to your attention. And the first is, what happened to generativity? And there's been a really robust conversation in that thread, because of course, we defined it early on in this week, but we haven't repeatedly said, hey, that's generativity, that's generativity. But as Anne pointed out, and Anne couldn't be with us today, she has to do some of her more clinical teaching, so she sends regards to Herb and to all of you out there in OldGlobe. One of the things that Anne pointed out is that they're just tremendous personal stories and examples of generativity going on. One of the most touching is one called Best Wishes for Madiba. So we all know that Nelson Mandela, I think at this point around the world, we know that Mr. Mandela is in hospital. And when we look at someone who is so iconic to the world, we can see in Mr. Mandela a remarkable sense of generativity. And I'll draw us back to the psychological definition of generativity, which really was launched into popular use by Erik Erikson, a psychologist who looked at psychological growth and development across the lifespan. And he made it the hallmark, the positive attribute of midlife, with the definition being something in general terms about care for the next generation, creating a legacy, and really transforming the notion that midlife was really about stability. And he put it in contrast because, of course, Erikson puts everything in contrast. He put it in contrast with stagnation and the idea that there was not much going on in midlife. And this was before his 8th stage, which is wisdom versus despair. So as you think about generativity at a population level and think about societal value and benefits, using Mr. Mandela perhaps as a touchstone, what sorts of things come to mind?
Well, I mean, let's start with the particular. I mean,
Yes.
it is the case, and this is a bit of the flaw in the kind of work that I and my colleagues do, where we're continually focusing on populations and so on, is that we look almost by definition at averages, you know.
Uh-huh.
And the world doesn't only move by averages. A lot of what constitutes action in the world is from exceptional individuals. So, you know, Nelson Mandela is, you know, of a handful. You know, you can tick off Václav Havel or something like this, but I mean, there aren't a lot of people like this around. And when you find one, and you know, and when they can have a life of the sort of integrity that they do, it's phenomenal. And you know, there is one relationship between that kind of particularistic thinking and what we do is that, you know, I do have a lot of colleagues who spend a lot of time looking at the oldest people. I mean, those rare people who are living to be 110, 11, and so on. And it's not so, you know, the case of a man like Nelson Mandela helps us understand just how unbounded the real bounds are for all kinds of people in terms of generativity, giving back, maintaining positive attitudes, you know, thinking about a longer term and so on. So people are, you know, are capable of a lot of that. Once you shift back to the population level, you get into this thing that I think I talked about initially, which is always having to distinguish a little between the life course of an individual and the aging in a population. Now, you know, Erikson was talking about the life course of an individual, and it may be what he defined literally in what ages hasn't changed too much about what constitutes the midlife. But the proportion of people who can expect in all kinds of societies, not just Western societies, to reach those midlife levels has changed dramatically. And the proportion of people who can imagine an older life and so on has changed dramatically as well. You know, one can pick up old texts, you know, from classics and so on, and realize that human beings haven't changed that much. You know, I'm always struck when I go over here to the Museum of Anthropology, Archaeology, and so on, and I see the translations of all these ancient stones and things like that, and it's always the same thing. You owe me money, so and so hasn't written me in a long time, and so on. I mean, some things never change. And I don't think those things are necessarily, you know, the way we deal with each other, the problems and the wonderful things that happen between generations within a family, outside a family, and so on. What you really got changing a lot is the proportion of people who will be able to experience those things at different ages.
Yeah.
Will that change the nature of a life cycle? It's hard to tell. The place we measure it better right now is not in psychological terms, but more in financial terms, which is the ages at which one generation starts turning over money to the next generation and so on. And that turns out to be surprisingly late. You know, so there's
I'm very interested to hear that.
Yeah, so I mean, but the transfers do move from old to young in all societies. There really aren't societies where things are going the other way. So
and I think that's important for us to sort of ponder and puzzle over, because one of the things that strikes me is that while we've seen extension in lifespan in many, many societies all around the world. What we're still seeing are issues of what is going on in midlife, for example, what is going on in later life, what is the nature of wisdom. And it may be that the chronological age at which wisdom is felt, or the ages where generativity seems paramount, are somewhat different. But the fact remains, and your point is so important, the fact remains that these are very constant human experiences.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Yeah. What's just different now is the way that we want to organize ourselves, including what constitutes wisdom. I mean, if you think about the existence of the internet and so on, right. The capacity to generate and to receive information is, just
mind-boggling.
Yeah, and it's not bounded in the same way it once was. Yeah. But we're going to have to sort out questions about what do you do with all this information, and is it necessarily better, and so on, and the extent to which people want to substitute things that come from those who are near and dear to them, from things that come from people who are connected in other ways. We're at an interesting time, and far be it from me to predict how it'll work its way out.
Yeah, well, and for me, that's a connection to what it is to participate in my first massive open online course. I mean, a few years ago, at least before the middle of the 2000s, when there was great sort of launching of massive open online courses in the UK and elsewhere around the world, and certainly more recently here in the US, we've got all this information, all this capacity for dialogue, and people have been commenting in the discussion threads, well, what is the role of wisdom? And I think that differentiating information, knowledge, wisdom, the essential nature of interpretation, appears to me to be sort of the looming question in some ways, because we're not really sure if all this information is an unmitigated good.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I'm looking at myself and trying not to sound too much like the older people I remember and so on, but it's not for nothing that so many of the things, like academic disciplines and so on, don't disappear. I mean, with respect to aging, if you think about it, I mean, people always want the same mix of things. They want the same mix of material well-being, economics. They want the same mix of, social status, what it means, who I am, who we are, where, so on, those kind of sociological concepts. Clearly, people worry more and more about their physical health, so they want the science, they want the nursing care, they want the medicine, and so on. But, a lot of it, better than most, is psychological, and yet beyond that, I'm sure you probably realize as well that a lot of times what people probably need, and I'm going to circle back on the word wisdom, is a philosopher.
Yeah.
It's not just that they're feeling discouraged or this or that. It's that, you got to put it all in some meaning frame.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking, is that meaning and a search for meaning that has relevance, both in sort of a timeless sense, but also in a sense that makes a difference now, seems to be consequential. And it looks like Brian's got a question for us, and he's going to hand me the iPad here. And the question is, from Sharon Rose. Thank you, Sharon Rose. Dr. Smith, can you share the projections of how the new higher aged population we have now will be resolved or balanced and used as a model for next generations growing into an aged population? So I think, Sharon, if I interpret your question correctly, in some ways what you're really asking is, what might we learn at the point we are now in understanding both increased life expectancy and increased longevity for the future? What's the impact there?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm both proud of and frightened by in my field is that demography is really one of the rare social sciences where you really can see the future. I mean, knock on wood, outside of anything truly catastrophic, very good ideas of what societies are going to look like 50, 60 years from now in terms of the age distributions and so on. They are old now, and they're going to get older. It is true. There are baby boomers. I'm right in the middle of the true baby boom in the United States and so on. And we're a little bigger and so on. But we don't really see any populations where fertility has fallen, which is to say almost all populations, where fertility really seems to go back up again. A few places have kind of brought it back to, the French are terribly proud of having raised their fertility levels to something near replacement levels and so on. But absent some world that nobody's ever seen before, our societies are going to be older and older and older, and they're going to look, we have these things called population pyramids, but whereas once upon a time there were lots of young people supporting a few older people, and it's not hard to imagine at that point how everybody could have given deference and obeisance and so on to aging people, because there are only a few of them. On the other hand, when your populations look like this, aging people are thick on the ground, who needs them? I mean, wisdom is everywhere. You got all these opinions up there. So what's going to happen? I mean, it's like I said when I was here last time. The good thing about this is that it happens slowly. It's happening now. It's going to continue. It's not, though, there aren't going to be, I doubt, too many things like the baby boom generation in the future. So we're going to adjust slowly. But it's going to involve, at the core, I think, figuring out the following trade-off. And it relates to generativity. And it's essentially this. On the one hand, you can think about it this way. You can think about people living longer, more years in which they're alive, or they're not disabled. We have much more of an understanding now of how people can, keep mind, body, whatnot active, and so on. So there's what the economists would say is, and the educations people have are getting better. So there's just going to be an incredible supply of what the economists would call embedded human capital. I mean, that is to say, people have invested in the health and education of people, and they're going to be around longer and longer, and presumably can do more and more things. So, on one hand, you say, well, this is great. This is a boon to productivity and so on that'll help us and whatnot. But you run into this other problem, which is that you want there to be a certain kind of replacement going on in society, and there's this whole question of whether people at the top monopolize positions that would be better suited in a kind of intergenerational thing to people at the bottom. And so, depending on where you sit or what you get involved with, or whether you're feeling like, you're being put out to pasture too soon, or you're being thwarted at entry, you're going to have strong feelings one way or the other. But at a societal level, it's going to be, the successful societies are going to figure out how to balance this, how to encourage a little more fertility, how to create societies, frankly, that are open with respect to migration, so that the world can sort itself out a little bit better and balance these things. If you go to Africa and pick a country in Central Africa, Congo or something like that, believe me, they don't look like old societies yet by any means. And it's in some sense going to be the capacity of the Belgians and the French to assimilate Congolese into their societies that'll tell you in some sense, whether these are going to be active societies and whether there'll be some release for people in the Congo and so on, which is, in some sense overpopulated and whatnot, or not. And these are fundamental problems. Sorry, I've ranged over a bunch of things in that answer.
I think these are really critical examples for us to think about because, you know, your comments are helping us to do two things: to differentiate from the individual perspective, that of the population, and the idea of managing the transition to an aged society, and often a very aged society, successfully. And so the idea of Belgium and France and the Congo really allows us to see that in real terms. The other thing that you're helping me to return to, and that I hope you're helping OldGlobe participants see, is that here are two attached concepts then to your comments. One is retirement, because I think certainly in a high-income nation sense, we've talked about retirement as the cessation of a work life and the movement into leisure. And we've mentioned this in different ways in other parts of the course, but I think it bears our attention again. And then, of course, there's the connection, and you've mentioned government and government policy, as well as the demography of a particular society. And that makes me think about gerontocracy. So in aged societies, the chances of gerontocracy, which is definitionally speaking about an oligarchic rule, think about the former Soviet Union, for instance, an oligarchic rule where those ruling are considerably older than the general population. But I think that we can take that idea of gerontocracy and the governance of a society by an older ruling body, if you will, or ruling members, as an important thing to consider, sort of like retirement at a more individual level. What does it mean to have phases or shifts in careers, in government, as opposed to hard boundaries? For example, where retirement is you either work or you're working or you're not.
Right. Right.
So thoughts on that?
Yeah, so let me pick up two threads from that. So the first one is this gerontocracy business, which is again, you know, it's like I said, when your population's going to look like this or something like that, you know, you're not too many people up here and so on. Well, if we're talking about gerontocracy, you gave the example of the former Soviet Union, you know, where we're literally talking about the people running the place. You know, that's one thing. What's kind of curious or interesting to me is that in some ways, it seems to me that the kind of societies who are most prone to a real gerontocracy are aging democratic societies. Because, you know, we know this pretty well in the US. There was a little bit reversal lately in the Obama campaigns, but in general, older people are more likely to participate. So partly the age structure gives you a lot of older people, and partly, and in some ways more importantly, their propensity to go to the polls to vote their Social Security interest and things like that means that whether the active face of the leaders is a person who's 80 or a person who's 45, the truth is that the politics is often being targeted disproportionately to older ages. You know, again, depending on where you sit, you might say that's, you know, that's good or bad. Right. But the rather interesting thing in a democracy is that older people maintain a far greater control of the political landscape than just their numbers are great, but I mean, than even their numbers would suggest. That's right. That's right. And you know, one interesting thing will be whether or not that changes. You know, in participation, you can write all kinds of stories about. I mean, you know, again, just to take the recent Supreme Court case, you know, rolling back the voter discrimination statutes from the 60s in the South and so on. I mean, you know, one way of looking at all of these things is not just in terms of the battle between the Republicans and the Democrats or racial issues and so on, right, in the United States, but you know, the more you can sort of limit the franchise, the more it tends to favor, maybe not necessarily the oldest old, but I mean a kind of class of people who, you know, can maintain their voting rights and so on, and cut other people out. So sometimes you cut out people of different ethnic groups or colors. Sometimes you just kind of cut out young people because they're not in the same paper-based, system as older people and so on.
The power is different.
Right. So,
Yeah.
I mean, in some kind of funny ways, everybody needs to keep their eye on whether, strangely, even if the smiling faces aren't old, the political system is way too tilted toward older ages. So that's one issue about gerontocracy, especially in democratic. So I said I would pick up two things, and of course now I've got the classic problem. What was my second?
Something about retirement, maybe?
The boundedness of retirement. Thank you. I mean, again, this depends a lot on your perspective on society. To go back to this whole thing about what does it matter what older people have invested in them and so on. And again, the two countries I spend the most time in, mostly the US, but also in France, they have very different perspectives on the whole thing. The French have what essentially we call in my business the Malthusian model, which is that there's sort of limits to things. And they, people mock them for it, but they have an exceptionally low retirement age, partly because they believe, people should have time for leisure and relaxation. And probably no country like France has been able to create, a good life, or as the Italians say, la dolce vita. But I mean, it's the French who have it. So that's one thing, but it's also very much connected to the idea that you got to get out when you're 58, 59, 60, 61, so the 20, 21, 22, 23, 24-year-olds will have somewhere to go into. The United States, on the other hand, we tend to be more of the more, and our view is essentially that, look, if you got more people who are still productive and so on, they create more things as the economy grows, as there's more things going on and so on. That's how you create places for younger people and whatnot. And so, we stripped whatever 20 years ago mandatory retirement ages from all but a few professions and so on. It's got its benefits and it's got its problems. So again, I think everybody's going to have to sort of saw back and forth between these two perspectives that, hey, everything's kind of fixed, and if people don't get out and do something, we don't have we don't have places for the people coming behind. And the alternative, which is kind of saying, look at all this human potential we've got out there, let's just put it into, and there, sharp bounds about what's retired and what isn't tend to work against in the best sense of the word, the productive exploitation of human capital and human potential.
And in thinking about that, I wonder then how our participants will see some of their future portfolio assignments, because as you pointed out, we can sort of put France and the United States as bookends on, for example, the question of retirement. We could see other bookends in terms of gerontocracy, especially because, Herb, you've given us, if you want to say it this way, the 21st century definition of gerontocracy. I mean, that classic definition of who are the ruling class, who are the current rulers, particularly in an oligarchic sense, rather than in democracies, for instance, suggests then that we have to cast off some of these old and stale definitions, whether it's in gerontocracy, in generativity, or in the ideas, the more tangible ideas of retirement. And it makes me wonder how people will look around themselves in their own communities to see examples. I mean, because as we started the conversation of around generativity, thinking about Mandiba, we can also look closer to home and see, as you point out, those phenomenal leading lights across the world. And they're just a very small handful of them, but on a smaller scale. Of course, we see community activists and leaders and rulers sometimes really setting a different pace. I wonder, because you do spend time between the US and France, are there any things that you've read in the newspaper or witnessed or had conversations about in either or both societies that have made you think about issues like gerontocracy, generativity, in different ways?
Yeah,
Recently?
well, I mean, it's you know, again, as societies go, the French, France, and the United States are not so terribly different, and yet they are amazingly different in terms of the rule systems that govern, you know, what you get at ages and things like that, because the French system is a very fixed one, and it's really that notion of retirement and so on that has given me pause. It's not as though older people seem unhappy in France. There's, you know, again, we could look at the data, and I don't think there's, you know, any evidence that people don't enjoy having retirement and so on. But I guess I do get struck by what seems to me to be a bit of a waste when you have a very literate, highly educated population, where essentially you're kind of saying to people, well, look, you know, I mean, you can still show up for lectures and go to libraries and things like this, but it's going to be hard to stay in your positions and so on. It's, you know, it's something interesting to see. And yet they have a wonderful, you know, which strangely is not that different. It's not a socialized medical system, but you know, at you know, roughly half the cost, they live a little longer than Americans do, and people actually do have the choice of, you know, picking their doctors, paying their doctors. There's plenty of private doctors and so on. It's pretty easy to see when you go to a country like France that it really wouldn't take much to reorganize the provision of health care, you know, so that you got basically the same benefits and, you know, pick a number, a third of the cost or half of the cost or something like that. So it's out there.
Yeah, well, and that's Herb's alluding to the fact that here in America, we spend almost 20% of our gross domestic product on healthcare, and yet we don't have, for instance, the life expectancy to show for that. And that then brings up this idea of, are there local solutions? And that local could be for your community or it could be for your nation. Are there local solutions that, once you look elsewhere around the world, as you pointed out, Herb, seem a little bit more feasible? It wouldn't take much, because there are lots of similarities, to dampen out the differences structurally so that the outcomes look a little bit more in line. Because, of course, our investment return here in America, for instance, really is pretty limited when you think about that 20% of GDP going to healthcare costs. And that, if you are here in America, you're probably conscious of the fact that that's a big societal debate these days. I'm going to kind of pause here and look across the table. You can't see Brian, but I can, and ask Brian, do we have any other questions coming in on the discussion forums? We've got 2 of them. Okay, and anything on Twitter that you've seen? Okay, so 2 questions for the discussion forums, because we're coming close to the end of our time. Lutisha Paland asks, in the US, there are several states that allow you to die with dignity. What can we do in the states that don't have that legal right? And this is a concern for many of us, having control in the last days. And perhaps I can actually answer that question.
You're going to know that one.
Yeah, and I guess, Lutisha,
I'll be interested in the answer.
Yeah, you know, this is something that I think about at a societal level as much as I do a healthcare level as a nurse. And that is that while we can do a good deal with policy, and some states have developed legislation here in America that aim toward death with dignity, giving a great deal of control, even to the point of assisted end of life, so that people have the opportunity to really choose when they would like their lives to end, with concerns about the experience of suffering. But here's one of the more interesting things to consider, and that is that in states and societies, we can think about the Netherlands, for instance, where that is the case, where you have legislation that really sort of says to citizens, this is within your control, many people don't take advantage of it. Many people are not likely to say, okay, this is really, this is the end for me. Instead, what we see in far greater numbers, and Herb, I think you'll probably be interested in this again from a population perspective as well as a human perspective, is that it is often the sort of communal and social values around what is dignity, what is possible at the end of life, and the value of end of life. And let me give you a concrete example of that. And that happens when we see people choose options for symptom control. Many people, for example, will forego pain medicines because they feel as though they will be clouded, their mental states will be clouded, and they wish to spend more time with the people they love. That's a very personal, individualistic, and particularistic interpretation of death with dignity. What's dignified for one may not be dignified for all. Of course, at a policy level, I do want to say that I think it's really, really important that we understand that, particularly with where health sciences are and health care practice is today, excuse me, we don't want to miss the understanding that even in very financially feasible, accessible ways, we can control symptoms of most chronic non-communicable diseases so that people should not die and should have access to the alleviation of physical as well as emotional suffering. And I'm reminded of so many of you in OldGlobe who are healthcare providers, social care providers, and spiritual care providers. Just our participants alone represent the multifaceted nature of what care for people who are coming to the close of their lives should be.
Yeah, and so let me just, this is very interesting. Let me just add quickly that, you know, this is, again, I want to plead unimportance in the following sense. Many of these kinds of issues that are what you've rightly said are personal issues, social issues, and so on, right to die, and so on, they don't show up at all at demographic scale. That is to say, if you compare the Netherlands, the US, Oregon, and things like this, it's just as you say, yes, in a clinical setting, yes, in a personal setting, yes, within a family, people have different experiences, know different things, and so on. At the kind of aggregated level, you know, who's taking advantage of these things and so on, it's comparatively small. You don't, you're not going to see these things. So that I think it's important to recognize that people are basically talking about individual human suffering as contrasted with, you know, people's sort of, you know, views, whether they're philosophical, religious, and so on. But these are not things that are playing out at the population level. At the population level, what we know is, even as our driver's licenses are showing us older, the amount of disability and, yes, suffering at the end of life is not changing a heck of a lot. You know, so that it's, so I'm just trying to say, most of what I do at the population level is just going to give people some idea of things that have a resolution and that don't, and we have no resolution on issues like that. Sorry.
I think, I think that's such essential material, philosophic material for what I think will be our last question for today. And that is that Guadalupe Patricia Solar Ramirez asks, will it be possible to slow aging after 150 years, maintaining acceptable health? Some scientists say yes. Another simply impossible, saying, but you are saying, and what are the resources or theories? So Guadalupe, you are asking a most intriguing biological question, and I'm going to just briefly respond and say that there are lots of theorists out there looking at maximum human lifespan. Essentially, I think that if you're asking about the idea of anti-aging or longevity, we're looking at a maximum human lifespan that's probably around 120 years. That's what we've seen for decades, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And as a result, there probably is little current science to suggest that we're going to see any growth beyond that in large numbers, or that we're going to develop any really magical answers to slowing the process of biological senescence. But I think if you turn to the discussion forums, what really is different is how people and when people interpret critical points in their own lifespans. And that goes back to Herb's comment about the fact that just in recent, the past century, we've added really about 20 years to the life expectancy that we see in at least high income and high middle income nations. And so maybe a humorous point on which to end is that when people joke that 60 really is the new 40, they're kind of not kidding.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I want to reinforce that. I have lots of colleagues who spend a lot of time with other colleagues looking at fruit flies and things like that, trying to figure out whether in some chromosomal, all kinds of, things you can sort of delay aging. And, this may be missing the forest for the trees because functionally we've done it.
That is an idea I really like. Functionally, we have done it. And that is that what we've seen at very important chronological turning points in the lifespan, we've seen remarkable functional gains in that lifespan, as well as having extended that average life expectancy at least 20 years.
Rent a movie from the 1940s, figure out from the plot what the ages of the characters are, and look how they carry themselves.
Yeah. And of course, I'm a big fan of films from the 40s, both here, those produced here in America and elsewhere. So I love that idea. Yeah. So we'll ask you for this next week, if you can, to spend some time watching old films that you haven't seen for a while or have never seen, particularly for those of our younger Old Globe participants. I really have to thank her
I'm always happy to be
for coming
here.
back. Yeah. Very exciting. And you probably saw a number of points that Herb made that reiterate what he said in his video interview, as well as what Michael Deli Carpini had said. So do return to those in your studying. And we will see you again on the 10th of July at 11:30 here on the East Coast of the United States. Amy Corcoran and Liz McKenzie will be with us then. And we're going to hope that Herb might be able to come back and join us for our final Old Globe webcast in week 6.